happiness is possible even for a billionaire. We think, if only I had more wealth, then I'd be happy. But Marcus says, there is a number that will crush you. Extreme wealth is hard mode for happiness. Marcus Aurelius had 13 kids. 7 of them died before they reached adulthood. Misfortune, nobly born, is good fortune. Diogenes is what you get if Socrates and Rousseau had a kid, and that kid decided to be a terrorist. So many great men, Goethe, Jefferson, Frederick the Great, have looked at this book for inspiration. More so than any other work, it feels like I'm not just exposed to a set of ideas, but I've been introduced to a man, and dare I say a friend. Many books claim to be life-changing, but this is a rare one that actually is. Marcus Aurelius was a Stoic philosopher and the greatest emperor of Rome. And we can see how great Marcus was by the sheer amount of challenges that he had to overcome. In the north, a barbarian horde had broken through the frontiers and pushed all the way to northern Italy. In the east, his own general rebelled and threatened to take his throne. And all of this happened while one of the worst plagues in antiquity was ravaging his population. By all reasonable accounts, Rome should not have survived the 2nd century. But because of Marcus, Rome not only survived, but it thrived. He led his troops from victory to victory, he stabilized imperial politics, and he extended the Pax Romana against all odds. And the crazy thing is, that's not even close to what's most impressive about the guy. The most impressive thing about Marcus is that he dealt with all of those challenges with Zen-like inner peace. And the seductive promise of this book is that you can be like Marcus too. His tranquility, his effectiveness, his resilience are available to you. The Stoic ideal is not the purview of some elect, but available to all rational beings. Now, there's just one problem, which is that this book isn't an instruction manual you can just easily apply to your life. In fact, this isn't even a book at all. These are the diaries of Marcus that he wrote while fighting on the front lines. And what they contain are nuggets, are snippets of philosophical wisdom, but not his entire philosophical perspective. So I think it's all too common to pick up the Meditations, read a passage, and because of how easy and accessible it is, to think you got it. But Stoicism is not just pithy one-liners. It's not just getting a memento mori tattoo and calling it a day. The core of Stoicism is about inducing a radical change in perspective. That philosophical perspective is the key to unlocking the value of this work for your life and what we will be covering in this lecture today. We're going to go through a condensed version of the education Marcus himself would have received from his imperial tutors so that you too can learn to see the world like the Stoic emperor. If you want to follow along this episode via transcript, or if you want to be invited to one of my future lectures, then please join my email list at jonathanb.com. And without further ado, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Now, before I read the Meditations and I thought Stoic, what came to my mind was this stern dad figure. Okay, he gets up every day at 5 a.m., he does his ice bath, and then his powerlifting routine, and then he grinds through the rest of his day like an absolute machine. You're pretty sure he loves you? You're pretty sure, okay? Takes care of your family, he doesn't cheat on your mom, but you're not sure, okay? He's never said it. He sure as hell never showed it. And don't get me wrong, it's not like he's a bad guy. It's simply that you wouldn't want to have him over for dinner too often, because he's a bit boring, he's emotionless, he doesn't seem to care. This is a common critique I think people have of Stoicism, which is that the Stoics don't care, even when they should. And they cite this one line as proof. I quote to you, Marcus. When you kiss your child goodnight, you should say silently, tomorrow, perhaps, you will meet your death. Now, the common reaction to that quote is to say, what kind of morbid wisdom is this, right? Even if I could stop caring about my kids, even if that would make me happier, that's not a worthy trade-off. The first thing I'll say in defense of Marcus is that whatever this is not Marcus talking out of his ass. Marcus Aurelius had 13 kids. 7 of them died before they reached adulthood. And he had to deal with each of their passing while putting out fires in the empire. That's what's so incredible about this work. which is that Marcus doesn't just talk the talk, he walks the walk. And I want you guys to keep that in mind, especially once he starts to say the crazy stuff later on in the lecture. Here's the second thing I'll say, which is that this critique of Stoicism as based off of detachment, not caring about things, is based off of a misconception. And I can begin to tease out what's missed by peeling back to that very quote. Because people only pay attention to the second half of the quote, right? Tomorrow, perhaps you will meet your death. But what they ignore is the first half, when you kiss your child goodnight. What people miss is the gentle kiss, right? It's the clear care. It's the legitimate love that has formed this tender nightly ritual. That is as much a part of Stoicism as the harsh anticipation on death. So it's not so much that this stern, detached dad caricature is wrong as it's simply incomplete. Because Stoicism is not just about strength and resilience, but also about love and gentleness and care. And above all, it's about a deep engagement with the world. But when you put it that way, the term sheet the Stoics are handing us seems almost too good to be true. You can have the happiness of a monk while maintaining in the world. You can rear a family. You can have great wealth and power. You can be emperor if you want to. You don't have to retreat from the world because the Stoics will teach you how to retreat into yourself. I quote to you, Marcus. People look for retreats in the country, by the coast, or in the hills. And you too are especially inclined to feel this desire. But this is altogether unphilosophical, when it is possible for you to retreat into yourself at any time you want. There is nowhere that a person can find a more peaceful and trouble-free retreat than in his own mind. This is why I think so many great men, be it Goethe or Jefferson or Frederick the Great, have looked at this book for inspiration. Because it teaches an art of life that enables you to act effectively in the world while not being corrupted by it at all. My goal today in this lecture is to give you the philosophical perspective, give you an understanding of the set of ideas that make such an orientation possible. And I'd like to begin with an exercise. So take out the pen and notepad that I gave you. And I want you to write down 3 of the most important things you think you need for a good life, okay? So 3 of the most important things you think you need for a good life. Whatever comes to your mind, I just want the intuition. And while you do that, let me give you some context. All we're gonna do in this lecture today is we're gonna examine 3 of the key ethical claims of Stoicism, which is gonna ladder us into their perspective. And the first key claim of Stoicism is that external goods do not determine happiness, okay? So the claim is that no external goods necessarily will sway your life, good or bad. Okay, that's what the claim is. So let's examine some of these goods, and let's start with the highest good. Okay, let's start with clearly the most sacred and precious thing we have in our lives, money. Who had money as one of their 3 most important goods in life? Come on, don't be shy. I know what you guys do for a living, okay? You didn't enter into finance to make the world a better place. Who had money, wealth, having a roof over your heads, any material goods, anything. Okay. This is, okay. You guys know what money is, right? It's like, it's the thing that you use to buy stuff. Okay, let's examine money, this thing that allegedly no one here in this room in Tribeca cares about. And let me try to articulate the common view of money. And it goes something like, look, money is clearly not sufficient for happiness, okay? There's plenty of wealthy people who are miserable, but money is necessary. I do need a certain amount of wealth. I can't be starving on the streets and be happy. And look, the marginal utility of money may decrease after a certain point, right? After, I don't know, 100K, 200K, 300K a year, but it's still a good. So the more the better. That's kind of the average view, the common view. This is Marcus's view on money, and it's my favorite line in all the Meditations. Happiness is possible, even in a palace. Do you guys get why I like it so much? Let me translate this into modern speak and you'll get it. Happiness is possible, even for a billionaire. Marcus completely flips our intuition on its head. We think, if only I had more wealth, if only I lived in a palace, if only I had $1 billion, then I'd be happy. But Marcus says, there is a number that will crush you. Too much money can be a bad thing that can completely corrupt you. And I think the easiest thing to point to here is how wealthy families, the wise ones at least, the extraordinary lengths they go to protect their own children from their own money, right? Whether it's designing a trust structure, donating it away, trying to hide it for as long as they can, because they understand more money is not better. This is why whenever I meet the kid of a billionaire who's turned out well, I'm so much more impressed than if that same kid came from the middle class. And this is also why Marcus Aurelius himself is so damn impressive. Because Marcus was the super rich kid of his day. Any luxury good that he wanted, any sexual act, any feast, any blood sport that he wanted to see, he could have. And he became the most virtuous person in Rome regardless. If you want to get a sense of how incredible of an achievement that is, all you need to do is to look at who the other emperors were. Look at all the spoiled brats that followed Marcus. Look at Hadrian. Hadrian, one of the 5 good emperors, was a shameless pederast and persecuted senators out of paranoia. In all likelihood, that's who Marcus should have become, and it's who Marcus had to fight incessantly every day to avoid becoming. I quote to you, Marcus. "Take care you are not turned into a Caesar or stained with the purple. These things do happen, so keep yourself simple." Even as a kid, Marcus was painfully aware of just how much the things we traditionally consider to be good can corrupt us. So even though it was not just accepted, but expected for young men to have sex, he fought very hard to protect his chastity. Even though he came from a noble family, he decided to wear the rags of a philosopher and sleep on the floor. Even as his peers all got into blood sports and watching chariot racing, he got into philosophy. And so it was only by actively pushing back against everything associated with the palace that he developed his virtue. Now, crucially, Marcus does not say it's impossible to be happy in a palace. That would be another way that an external good determines your happiness. There are billionaires who are uncorrupted by their money. There are rare philosopher kings who can be happy even in a palace. Marcus's point is simply that extreme wealth is hard mode for happiness, in the same way that extreme poverty is hard mode for happiness. But even on that extreme end of the spectrum, we can point to many counterexamples of monks, of artists, of thinkers who lived in relatively material impoverishment, but who had great lives. We can even point to people like Gandhi, the Buddha, and Wittgenstein, who were born into great wealth, who actively gave that wealth up in order to live a good life. So here's the punchline. If you have good skill, if you're skilled, if you're good, if you know what you're doing, you can be happy in a palace, you can be happy completely impoverished. If you don't have great skill, great wealth and poverty will absolutely crush you. And that's why money does not determine our happiness, because the deciding factor is clearly the skill thing, right? Which we're going to elaborate a bit more on later on. So that's money. Maybe you guys aren't that impressed, right? Well, I never thought money was that important anyways. Let's try something a bit more serious. Health. Who had health as one of their key goods? Okay. Very wise audience today. Health is important, and surely we can't be happy if we're sick. Surely we can't be happy if we're in pain the whole time. And the Stoics say, no, there's plenty of counterexamples. Stephen Hawking, paralyzed for the majority of his life. Do we really want to say that's not a good life? Beethoven went deaf, literally lost the faculty he needed for composition, still ended up composing the Ninth Symphony. Our friend Marcus had terrible health, chronic gut issues, frail constitution, dead before he was 60. Didn't prevent him from living a good life. The Stoics are going to go so far as to say even torture, not just no health, active extreme pain, does not need to determine your happiness. Because there are people who underwent torture and who self-report it didn't rob them of a good life. The best example here is probably this guy called James Stockdale. So James Stockdale was a US Navy pilot. He was shot down in Vietnam. He spent 8 years in prison, 4 of which were in solitary confinement. And not only did Stockdale not receive any medical attention for his broken leg, he actively and routinely underwent torture that rebroke that same leg twice. To give you an idea of the circumstance he was in, the kind of man that he was, Stockdale bashed his own face to a pulp until it was swollen beyond recognition so that he wouldn't be used as political propaganda. He slit his own wrists when they discovered that he had incriminating information on his friends. Okay, that's the type of guy that he was. Now, despite that, when Stockdale got out, he self-reports that even 8 years of torture didn't rob him of a good life. It didn't break his will in camp. He went on to be a professor at Stanford and even run for the vice presidency here in America. And when people ask him, how the hell did you do it? How did you make it through? His answer was Stoicism. So he had encountered the Stoic texts before he got shot down, and it was specifically their teachings on physical resilience that he cites as what got him through. Okay, so I quote to you, Stockdale. Your deliverance and your destruction are 100% up to you. No one can harm you without your permission. And by harm, Stoics always mean harming your inner self, your self-respect, and your obligation to be faithful. He can break your arm or your leg, but not to worry, they'll heal. So even torture does not have to determine your happiness if you don't let it. Even in these extreme scenarios, it's still 100% up to you, right from the horse's mouth. Now you might say, okay, enough with these like extreme edge cases here with Beethoven and with James Stockdale and Wittgenstein. Surely life tends to go better without torture, right? Surely life is better lived in wealth than in poverty. The Stoics will say, of course, and they're going to fold this into their theory as we're going to see later on. But that's not what's in contention right now. What they want to argue against is simply that any external good, even torture, will necessarily sway your life, good or bad. So all they need is one counterexample here. Okay. We looked at health, we looked at wealth. Let's try something that surely our philosopher king would think would be necessary for a good life, and that's philosophy. I'm afraid to ask, who had philosophy as one of their top 3 goods? Books, give me something. Intellectual life, talking, thank you. That was a hand out of pity, but I appreciate it nonetheless. Okay, this is what Marcus has to say about philosophy. What then can guide us on our way? One thing and one thing only, philosophy. This is what he has to say about philosophers. What are Alexander, Caesar, and Pompey when compared to Diogenes, Heraclitus, and Socrates? For the latter, the philosophers, were self-determined. As to the former, the rulers, consider how many cares they had and how many things they were enslaved to. Think about how extraordinary that is. That the emperor of Rome would consider Alexander, Pompey, and Caesar to be slaves when compared to the great philosophers, okay? Whatever this philosophy thing is, it sounds pretty good, right? But then Marcus also says, I'm grateful that when I first wanted to do philosophy, I did not fall in with any sophist or settle down to pore over books or analyze syllogisms or occupy myself with the study of celestial phenomena. Give up your thirst for books so that you do not die grumbling on. Even philosophy can be abused. If you treat it as a mere intellectual puzzle, even philosophy can lead you astray. Because what philosophy ought to be, for Marcus, is the art of life. So it's about living the good life and not just about knowing what the good life is. But even if you practice philosophy in this good way, in the way that Marcus does, it can still have very negative consequences. In the case of Marcus, most of his subjects did not like the fact that their king was a philosopher. Why? Philosophers are pedantic. They lecture at you. They're boring. They're not fun people. Or so my ex tells me. And in the case of Marcus, people were worried that they had a Puritan as a leader, that he would get rid of all the blood sports and the fun games and the fun feasts, that he was going to put an end to all the fun. Now let me be clear here. philosophy as activity, examining one's life, deliberating over what to do, that is going to prove to be somewhat necessary for a good life. But everything around philosophy, everything else around philosophy, the arguments, the book, the rags that philosophers wear, that is what can lead you astray. So it's precisely the external parts of philosophy that do not determine your happiness. Okay. So we looked at three goods: health, wealth, and philosophy. And we saw that none of them determined your happiness. Now, this argument is actually not exclusive of the Stoics. It's shared by a lot of the Greek schools at the time: Plato, Aristotle, the Cynics, and the Stoics. And so we're going to start bringing in these other schools because they're going to shed light on unique aspects of Stoicism. So the image I want you guys to hold in mind of this group of philosophical schools is of a quarrelsome family over dinner. Okay, Plato's the dad, he's the patriarch. Aristotle's the older brother. Cynics are the middle brother. The Stoics are the youngest brother. Now, each of these three brothers think that they are the legitimate heirs to their father's intellectual heritage. So each of them think that they have the unique key to happiness. Now, because they are brothers, their philosophy actually shares more commonalities than differences. But because they're quarrelsome brothers, they make a big deal out of whatever differences they do have and end up defining their identity through that. Okay, so it's by bringing in these other schools that we're going to truly learn who the Stoics are. Because it's by examining how the youngest kid, the Stoic, grows up in this family and how he established his identity against his older brothers, that's going to tell us something about who the Stoics really are. And so that's the picture I want you to hold in mind of this quarrelsome family. And I'd like to start with the father, Plato. Because Plato in his Euthydemus is going to lay out the common starting point for all three brothers. I quote to you Plato: "Would a man with no sense profit more if he possessed and did much, or if he possessed and did little? Look at it this way. If he did less, would he not make fewer mistakes and be less miserable? Yes, indeed," the interlocutor said. "And in which case would one do less, if one were poor, or if one were rich? Poor," he said. "And if one were weak or strong, weak. If one were held in honor or in dishonor, dishonor. And slow rather than quick, and dull of sight and hearing rather than keen. We agreed with each other on all points of this sort. With respect to all the things we called good in the beginning, the correct account is not that in themselves they are good by nature, but rather as follows. If ignorance controls them, they are greater evils than their opposites. But if good sense and wisdom are in control, they are greater goods. In themselves, however, neither sort is of any value." Okay, so this is just a summary of the critique of externals. This is the first claim of not just the Stoic school, but the common starting point for all three brothers. Externals do not determine your happiness. If you aren't skilled, you'd rather be poor rather than rich, you'd rather be dull rather than sharp, you'd rather be timid rather than courageous, because you're going to mess up less. And as we saw, if you are skilled, you can thrive even in poverty, even while being tortured. Now, this insight, I think, is such a paradigm shift because most of us do think about our happiness as a function of these externals, right? When I get the girlfriend or boyfriend, when I get the house or the promotion, then I'll be happy. And so this is the first thing that the Stoics are going to try to train us out of. And by train us out, they don't just mean philosophically. They don't just mean you can reconstruct the arguments in the Euthydemus, but that you intuitively see these things with a degree of indifference. So on top of Stoic philosophy, they're going to give us a series of therapeutic techniques. And what these therapeutic techniques are supposed to do is to make that philosophy intuitive. A specific technique that Marcus shares with us here is called the stripping method, okay? Which coincidentally is how I'm going to get more subscribers if this philosophy thing doesn't work out. So here's Marcus's stripping method. I quote: "When you have roast meat and such delicacies in front of you, form the impression that this is the corpse of a fish and that this is the corpse of a bird or pig, and again that the luxurious wine is grape juice, and the purple robe of the emperor is lamb's wool dipped in shellfish blood, and as for sexual intercourse, that it is the friction of an entrail and the expulsion of mucus accompanied by a kind of spasm. How good are these impressions at getting to the heart of things in themselves and penetrating them so you can see what they really are. Marcus's point is that so much of the allure that external goods have over us is because of the narratives we tell ourselves about them in our own heads. And so there's a very easy antidote, which is just to describe them as they are, okay? Sex, that's just rubbing followed by mucus. Gold, that's just shiny rocks. Honor, that's just randos saying nice things about you. Now you might be tempted here to say, okay, I'm gonna use the stripping method when things don't go well in my life, like if I get slandered. But Marcus says it's precisely when things are going well that you need to use the stripping method. Okay, I can continue quoting Marcus. You should use the stripping method whenever things seem most worthy of your trust. Show them naked and see how cheap they are, and strip away the story that they use to amplify their importance. Pride is clever at cheating by false reasoning, and it is when you are most convinced that you are engaged in worthwhile matters that you are most deceived. So his point is that you need to use the stripping method precisely when things are going well. And the reason is because you can't have one without the other. You can't feel validated when you get sex and not feel dejected when you get rejected. You can't feel excited about making money and not be upset about losing money. And so in my own life, I found I'm most pulled towards Stoic ideas when things aren't going well, because it's comforting. It's comforting being told, well, sickness can't really hurt you. Well, money didn't even matter that much anyways. But it's precisely when things are going well, when I start getting more money or more recognition, that's when I don't want to hear these lessons. But Marcus says that's when these lessons are most needed, because it's precisely on the upward trajectory of your life that it's most dangerous, because you're most incentivized to get attached to these externals. And so if you want tranquility when you lose money, the time to tell yourself that money doesn't matter, that it can't make you happy, is when you make money, okay? So that's the first move. The first move is to say, externals do not determine our happiness. Okay, the obvious question is, what the hell determines our happiness? And the Stoic answer is virtue. Virtue alone determines happiness. Okay, show of hands, who had virtue as one of their key goods? Okay, the Buddhist monk and the philosopher, exactly who I expected. So what virtue is agency appropriate to the situation. It's responding well to whatever circumstance you're in. So for eating, the virtue is moderation. Not eating too much, not eating too little. For law, the virtue is justice, right? Giving people their fair share. For, let's say, building a company, the virtue is courage. Not being overly timid, not being overly rash. So all virtue is making the best out of whatever circumstance you're in. And there's a passive component here. There's a judgment component that you relate to the circumstance in the best way. But there's also an active component that you're actively trying to improve that external circumstance. Okay? This is how Marcus makes that point. If you carry out the present action following right reason with determination, vigor, and good humor, and you are satisfied if your present action is in accordance with nature, and if what you say and utter is in accordance with heroic truth, you will lead a good life. There is no one who can prevent this. Sounds great. Sounds noble. Sounds poetic, philosophical. It's also batshit crazy if you think through the implications, okay? And to help you think through the implications, I'm going to start bringing in Aristotle, because this is where the family feud begins. And so before you sign the Stoic term sheet and give away your life to them, just look at the fine terms and see what you're getting yourself into. Quote to you, Aristotle. Since it is agency that determines the quality of a life, no blessed person could ever become miserable, since he will never do hateful and base actions, will bear strokes of fortune suitably, and from his resources at any time will do the finest actions. He will neither be easily shaken from his happiness, nor shaken by just any misfortunes, but he will be shaken from it by many serious misfortunes. The happy person, therefore, is the one whose activities accord with complete virtue, with an adequate supply of external goods, not for just any time, but for a complete life. So for Aristotle, externals don't determine your happiness, right? Because no amount of external goods will make the vicious person happy. No amount of external evils will make the virtuous person miserable. But Aristotle's point is that if you want full happiness, you're going to need some external supporting conditions. If even just as a material to practice virtue, right? You can't contemplate if you have no leisure. You can't be generous if you have nothing to give away in the first place. So what Aristotle is saying is that there are conditions in life that are so bad that even the best response to them will not result in happiness. And as we start this debate, I want you to keep in mind that Aristotle is already very, very far on the spectrum of ethics in terms of how important he thinks virtue is and how relatively unimportant he thinks externals are, okay? But this mostly virtue view is not good enough for the Stoics. The Stoics argue for a virtue-only view. Only virtue matters for happiness, only vice is a true evil, and their technical term for all externals is indifferent. All externals, it's not just that they don't determine happiness, they're complete indifference. Having or not having them does not matter at all for happiness. This is a crazy view, okay? This is the view of a crazy person. And to tease out just how crazy it is, entertain a thought experiment. So let's say we have two sages, okay? Complete virtue, as virtuous as you can be. But let's say one of them is really unlucky and one of them is really, really lucky. So let's say the unlucky sage is born deformed with no limbs. Let's say his parents give him up to an orphanage and the orphanage gets raided by a cartel. And in the raid, he suffers third-degree burns, and so he's in terrible pain his entire life. And the cartel decides to put him to solitary confinement for 30 years. Okay, so in solitary confinement, the only human contact he has is when he gets taken out and raped and tortured. And let's say on top of that, when he leaves solitary confinement, everything he does is an immediate failure to no fault of his own. So he starts a business, a tornado destroys the business. He finds a wife, aliens abduct the wife. He adopts 3 children, lightning zaps all 3 of them. So he dies alone to no fault of his own at 50. But because he's the sage, he reacts to everything virtuously, okay? So he's not angry with his rapist when he's getting raped. He's accepting when his kids pass away. But it's not just the passive part, he's actively trying to bring about a better life, right? He's courageously trying to build a business and a family, it just doesn't work out for him. Okay, now let's paint the picture of the lucky sage, who's the exact opposite. He's tall, he's handsome, he's athletic, he comes from an aristocratic family that loves and supports him, and everything he does is an immediate success, whether it's in finance or media or academia or athletics or in the military. And let's say he meets the love of his life, has a big old family, and dies surrounded by his loved ones at 120. And because he's the sage, he doesn't let any of this get into his head. Okay, so he's not an ounce arrogant. He's just a good guy. He's humble. He volunteers at the soup kitchen when he's 110 still, when he can still walk. He's just a great guy. Those are the two sages, lucky and unlucky sage. And the question is, who is happy? Who lives the good life? Now, Aristotle would say, look, I'm not going to call the unlucky sage miserable because he's virtuous, okay? So his soul is pure. But we are more than our souls, and so everything around that soul is so, I don't want to use the word filthy, it's been so defiled. I couldn't possibly call this man happy. He's not miserable. That's the most you're going to get out of me. And even if you wanted to call him happy, you must concede that he's at least less happy than the lucky sage, right? Clearly. The Stoics are literally given a version of this thought experiment in Cicero's De Finibus, and this is why I love them. They bite the philosophical bullet. The unlucky sage is happy. He's just as happy as the lucky sage. And here's the even crazier thing. It's not like the Stoics are using some weird definition of happiness here. What they mean by happiness, eudaimonia, is roughly what we mean by happiness. It's not exactly it, but it's close. And it's how well lived a life is, right? How worth living a life is. So what the Stoics are saying is that there's nothing about the lucky sage's life at all, not even an ounce, that makes it any more worth living than the unlucky sage's life. Okay? So if you're a good-for-nothing philosopher like me, this is where you take out the popcorn and you're just like, how in the world are you going to justify this position? And it turns out to be actually a lot more convincing than you think. So the first thing I'll say in defense of the Stoics is that we need to cut them some slack in the get-go because they're fighting an uphill battle. The claim is not, I would be happy in the unlucky sage's life. The claim is that the sage would be. Now the issue is, the perspective of the sage is so different from my perspective, arguments can only really go so far, okay? And so the most convincing arguments the Stoics are going to give here all have to do with appealing to our existing moral intuitions and then just projecting them out a bit. So here's the argument. Think about an aspect of your life that you really, really love, but you wouldn't be distraught if it was taken away from you, okay? For me, that's video games. I love video games. I travel with my PlayStation. I was invited on a super yacht, and the first thing I asked for was an Xbox. Now, if a demon were to come take away my PlayStation, and he said, Jonathan, no more video games for you for the rest of your life, I would go, okay, no big deal. Why? Because I do treat video games as what the Stoics call an indifferent. So indifferent doesn't mean I don't like the video game. It doesn't mean I don't enjoy it. It doesn't mean I won't try to game as much as possible if left to my own devices. It means I don't see having video games in my life as meaningful for my happiness. My life is not any less worth living for not having video games in it. And the Stoic claim is that the way that I relate to the demon taking away my PlayStation, that's a weird sentence, is the same as how the sage reacts to all the misfortunes that he suffers. And the only reason that I find this argument even somewhat plausible is because as a kid, I didn't treat video games as indifferent at all. Okay, I was super attached. If you told me I couldn't game for a month, I would have thought my life was over. And crucially as a kid, I also couldn't possibly conceive how I could ever treat video games as non-attached, as just an indifferent. But now I'm on the other side of that, and I do treat it as an indifferent, which again, doesn't mean I don't enjoy it, it just means it's not central to my happiness. I can see why that transition is both possible and good, right? It's good because I don't enjoy it less, my relationship with it is just a lot more freeing. And so the intuition is, maybe this kind of transition is possible for the other parts of my life that I do feel attached to as well. Here's another way to cut it. We all know people in our lives who treat the things that we're indifferent about as attachments, right? And when we look at them, we rightfully think it's pretty small-minded, it's pretty childish for you to think that if your party doesn't win the election, if the weather doesn't go your way, if your sports team doesn't win the Super Bowl, my life is ruined. But we also know people in life who treats the things that we're attached to as indifference, right? So I know people who aren't attached to money, all of you apparently. I know people who don't mind shouldering pain. I know people who aren't obsessed about their reputation. And the Stoic advice, the Stoic suggestion is to say, now look at your attachments from their perspective and see how petty and childish you look and think of whether your life would be better if those were turned into indifference rather than attachments. So what the Stoics are inviting us to do is to take this intuition that we've developed, right, about how it's both possible and good to view things as indifference, and then just projecting that along our entire life. So right now in this room, most of us, I hope, don't think that the weather determines our happiness. Now, a smaller group of us doesn't think that whether our sports team wins matters. A smaller group know that we can be happy in another career. A smaller group knows that we can be happy in another relationship. A smaller group can accept that our spouses may die before we do. And an even smaller group can accept that maybe one of our kids may die before we do. So the Stoic point is that we are on this spectrum of treating things as attachments or indifference, and they're simply just trying to push us all the way. And when we start to treat all of our life's avenues as indifference, then we get into the perspective of the sage. The sage is someone who treats every external in his life as an indifferent. And because he views life this way, every misfortune that he suffers is just like me losing my PlayStation. And so here's the kicker. The unlucky sage doesn't actually perceive himself as suffering any evils. It's just a series of indifference that he's been robbed of, a series of PlayStations. So this is the common misconception of Stoicism. People think that the Stoics are resilient by gritting their teeth and manning through all the evils in their life. But their actual resilience comes from the fact that they don't see evils in the first place. Does that make sense? So take the case of torture. The sage knows pain is not an evil. It's an indifferent. Which, again, doesn't mean that he won't do things to stop it. It just means that he knows it won't ruin his life. It doesn't determine his happiness. The sage knows that as strongly as I know 1 + 1 = 2. There's no amount of torture in the world that's going to get me to see 1 + 1 = 3. And there's no amount of torture in the world that's going to get the sage to think that pain is actually an evil, and so there's no evil to resist in the first place. Now, if you think this is absolutely crazy, let me just read you the story of the Stoic master Epictetus, who was a slave in his early life, and I think this story is going to bring this point alive, okay? When his master was twisting his leg and torturing him, Epictetus said, smiling and unmoved, "You're going to break my leg." And when it was broken, he added, "Did I not tell you that you would break it?" Okay, so Epictetus is not gritting his teeth. He's not manning through anything. His resilience comes from knowledge and not grit, okay? And look, I totally understand that these arguments aren't going to be fully convincing because again, Stoicism is the art of life, and the brute fact is that our life is so different from the sages that there's only so much that can be communicated through philosophy. But hopefully by appealing to these moral intuitions, I can get you to see at least why it would be plausible that the unlucky sage is not miserable. But there's something even stronger that Marcus wants to say here. It's not like the unlucky sage is just resilient. He treats these misfortunes almost as a challenge to be welcomed. I quote you, Marcus. "Be like the headland on which the waves break constantly, which still stands firm while the foaming waters are put to rest around it. It is my bad luck that this has happened to me. On the contrary, say, it is my good luck that although this has happened to me, I can bear it without getting upset, neither crushed by the present nor afraid of the future. This kind of event could have happened to anyone, but not everyone would have borne it without getting upset. Why is that case one of bad luck, rather than this case one of good? So in every future event that might lead you to get upset, remember to adopt this principle. This is not misfortune, for misfortune, nobly born, is good fortune." So the unlucky sage doesn't think, "Oh, I'm so unlucky, I got raped, I'm so unlucky, my wife got abducted by aliens." He thinks, no, I'm so lucky that I have the virtue to handle these situations. So here's the second kicker. Our unlucky sage doesn't actually consider himself unlucky. And again, this is not some cheap glass half full self-help trick. Because in the Stoic worldview, he is lucky because he has the only thing that is needed for happiness, which is virtue. And this, I think, is the most useful perspective I've taken away from Stoicism, even if you don't agree with the philosophy, which is to treat life's setbacks as challenges and not tragedies. So Marcus talks a lot about how if an obstacle gets in your way of doing the virtue of doing the thing you wanted to do, then that obstacle becomes the material to practice another virtue. So if I've trained my entire life to go into politics, to practice the virtue of justice, and a war starts, I'll just join the military to practice the virtue of courage. If I'm driving to the community center to practice the virtue of compassion and I get rear-ended, well, the person who hit me becomes the object, becomes material for practicing another virtue, which is just forgiveness. So it's through virtue that the sage, it's almost like alchemy, transmorphs misfortunes into goodness and therefore happiness. And so this is what I meant when I said that it's not just like the unlucky sage is not miserable. It's not like he's just getting from negative to zero. He's actively happy. So here's an analogy if it helps. I'm a big F1 fan, and in F1, it's a lot more difficult to drive in the rain than it is the dry. But the attitude of the best F1 drivers to the rain is not simply, oh, I can bear this. There's almost an active, giddy anticipation for the challenge. And we wouldn't want to stretch it too far, but there's kind of something similar going on with the psychology of the sage. So after all that argumentation, I hope you can get a sense, at least, of why the unlucky sage is just as happy as the lucky sage. So the unlucky sage doesn't treat any of the misfortunes he suffers as evil, any more than the lucky sage treats his good fortune as good. They're all indifference, right? So there's nothing to resist in the first place. That's why the unlucky sage is not miserable. Now, the reason that he's actively happy is that he responds to all of these misfortunes with virtue. So virtue helps him relate to external circumstances in the best way, and it pushes him to strive towards bringing about better circumstances. If this still isn't convincing for you, maybe I can leave you with one last image that will at least get the intuition of the Stoics across. So one of my friends recently did a pretty long mountaineering trip in the Himalayas on the Nepalese side. And when you do these week-long trips, you rest at what are called these tea houses. So these are essentially small guest houses in the mountains that are meant to cater for these hikers. And so he gets in one of these tea houses, and this one's barely more than a shack. And he sees this boy without his limbs, who looks pretty malnourished, who probably doesn't have a social life because he's 20 days away from civilization by mule, right? And he's beaming. He's beaming with joy. And then he happened to have internet connection at the time, so he was scrolling at Instagram at the exact instance, and he saw this girl on Instagram who was beautiful, who lived in this beautiful Malibu mansion beach house, was surrounded by her loved ones and had a career, and she was bawling out, crying, saying that her life was ruined because of the election. Okay, that's the kind of dichotomy, the image the Stoics want to put in front of you. The Stoics want to ask you, if externals matter, what is going on here? And so even if you don't agree with the extent of their philosophy, I think what's important to take away is the intuition that external goods, external circumstances matter a lot less for our happiness than we think, and how we relate to those, how we respond to those external circumstances matter a lot more than we think. That's the second point. That's the second claim of Stoic ethics. Before I go to the third point, which, believe it or not, is even crazier than the second point, I want to draw out quite an optimistic conclusion that flows out of the second point, which is that happiness is fully up to us. So what the Stoics think is up to us is just judgment, to put it simply. What comes out of judgment is action, desire, emotions, and that's it. So for the Stoics, what your true self is, what your true ego is, this is where it becomes different from Buddhism, where the Buddhists are about, in some sense, dissolving the self. The Stoics are about redirecting it to your proper self, which is this faculty of judgment. That's it. That's you. This is why, by the way, health was an external good, because health is not up to your control. There are things you can do to be healthy, but ultimately, whether you're healthy or not is not up to you. And this may seem quite pessimistic, but desires, judgments, actions, these are the only things you need for virtue. And virtue is the only thing you need for happiness. And so the intersection of Stoic psychology, what is up to your control, and Stoic ethics, what makes you actually happy, is the very optimistic conclusion that happiness is fully up to you. So focus on what is in your control, because congratulations, it turns out that's enough for happiness. Okay, let's take a step back and summarize how we got here. So the first claim that the Stoics make with the entire family, externals don't determine happiness. The second claim it makes, breaking from Aristotle, is that not only do externals not determine happiness, having them is a complete indifference. They're complete indifference. Virtue is the only thing that matters for happiness. Now, I think it's clear that we're not at the distinctive Stoic position yet. Because think through what the logical conclusion of these two steps are. External world doesn't really matter for my happiness. Virtue can smooth over all the bumps of fortune. The logical conclusion is to be a bum, right? Because you told me you can drive in the dry, you can drive in the wet. You told me you can be happy being tortured and impoverished, so who cares? So this is the serious challenge the Stoics need to face up to now, which is, why does the Stoic sage do anything? If you tell me through virtue you can be happy in any circumstance, why bother? And this is the challenge that the middle brothers, the Cynics, level against the Stoics, the youngest brother. Because the Cynics have actually joined the Stoics in breaking away from Aristotle, and now it's in this third step that the two brothers are going to diverge. And so just as we teased out what was so unique about the second Stoic claim vis-a-vis Aristotle, we're now going to bring in the Cynics to tease out what's so unique about Stoicism in this third claim, okay? So a Cynic would have nodded along, essentially, to everything we've said so far today. Externals don't determine happiness. Virtue is able to smooth over all the bumps of fortune. And where does that lead them? It leads them to the greatest bum of all time, Diogenes. Diogenes is the most famous of Cynic philosophers for reasons that will soon be obvious. First of all, he lived in a barrel like a dog, and he begged for sustenance. The word cynic actually comes from the Greek word dog-like specifically, and it was supposed to be derogatory until Diogenes took it upon himself as like a kind of like a superhero identity, like Dogman or something like that. And there's no better introduction to who Diogenes is and what he stands for than his legendary interaction with Alexander the Great. Okay, so I read to you one of Diogenes' biographers. Once Alexander the Great came and stood by Diogenes, who was bathing in the sun, and said, "I am Alexander the king." "And I," came the reply, "am Diogenes the dog." And when he was asked why he was called the dog, he said, "Because I fawn upon those who give me anything, bark at those who give me nothing, and bite the rogues." Alexander said to him, "Ask any favor you choose of me." Diogenes replied, "Get out of my sun." Alexander later said that if he were not Alexander, he wished he were Diogenes. If you squint really, really hard, you can see the kind of familial resemblance of Diogenes the Cynics and their two more noble brothers. There is something noble about not kowtowing to Alexander the Great, right? There is something high-minded about declining the most powerful man in the world writing you a blank check. And where this nobility comes from in all three schools is their relative indifference to external goods. But the Cynics kind of just take that to its logical extreme. If externals truly don't matter, let's not bother with any externals. So the most important distinction that the Cynics make is between nature and convention. So most of the external goods that we talked about so far, whether it's wealth or prestige or military honor, they think that's just conventional goods, right? Things that corrupt society has told us that we want. And so the core project of the Cynics is to disassociate himself, is to remove as many of those conventions in his life and to follow what's left, and that's nature, okay? Continue quoting his biographer. Diogenes saw a mouse running about and not seeking for a bed, and so he chose poverty. He saw a child drinking out of his hands, and so he threw away his cup. He saw a boy take up his lentils with a crust of bread, and so he threw away his spoon. This sounds great, right? You live simply, you follow nature, you speak truth to power, and you challenge all those oppressive conventions. It sounds great until Diogenes makes it very, very clear why some of those conventions existed in the first place. I continue quoting his biographer. At a feast, people kept throwing all the bones to Diogenes like a dog. In response, Diogenes peed on them, like a dog. You call me a dog. Why are you surprised? This is what a dog does. It gets better. It was his habit to do everything in public, everything. If eating is not absurd, then it is not absurd to eat in the marketplace. Do you see where this is going? Under the same logic, he would pleasure himself in public and say, if only I could resolve hunger by rubbing my belly. This is the tip of the iceberg for his shenanigans, okay? He spat on people's faces in their houses. He shat in the theater while a play was going on. Diogenes is what you get if Socrates and Rousseau had a kid and that kid decided to be a terrorist. Because like Rousseau, he has this innate suspicion of society. Like Socrates, he has this incessant need to stick his nose into other people's business. And like a terrorist, he always chooses the most shocking and disruptive way to do it. This is the great irony of Greek philosophy. The two schools with the most similar philosophical positions, the Cynics and the Stoics, one produced Marcus Aurelius, one produced Diogenes the Cynic. This is why I keep warning you. Look at the term sheet, look at the fine terms. Because if you've been nodding along to everything I've been saying in this lecture, you're in big trouble. You may think I'm teaching you how to become a noble philosopher king. I'm actually teaching you how to be a publicly defecating sex offender, okay? And at least that's who you're on your way to becoming without more philosophical intervention. And if you think I'm defiling the Stoics' good name by joining them to this hip with this dangerous provocateur, let me remind you, Marcus Aurelius idolized Diogenes. Remember that quote I read in the beginning? When he compares the three great philosophers with the three great rulers? Remember who the three great philosophers are? Socrates, Heraclitus, Diogenes. Diogenes was up there as one of his core role models. Even stronger, Stoicism literally comes out of Diogenes, in the sense that Stoicism's founder, Zeno, was trained as a Cynic by a Cynic, Crates. Who was Crates trained by? Diogenes. These two schools share so many similar philosophies that there end up being what are called unorthodox Stoics, people like Aristotle, who essentially just espouse cynical positions, right? So I hope you can start appreciating why I brought in the Cynics here. It's because if you actually agreed with everything I've said so far in this lecture, then it seems a lot more reasonable to piss on people and jack off in public, right? That sentence is definitely going to be misused somehow. But so the last question we need to answer is, why does the Stoic sage do anything? Okay? Why did they do anything? Just be like Diogenes. And here comes the third and final claim of Stoic ethics. Some externals are preferred indifference. Preferred indifference literally sounds like an oxymoron. When I first heard this claim, what it reminded me of was that line from Animal Farm. You know the one I'm talking about? All animals are equal. Some animals are more equal than others. What the Stoics are saying is, look, all externals are indifferent, but some externals are more indifferent than others. So if you have any philosophical popcorn left, this is where you take it out, because this is another one of those Stoic claims. You're just like, how in the world are they going to dig themselves out of this one? And again, it's a lot more convincing than you think. So let's try to understand this view first, which is that there are a set of external goods, health, wealth, justice, security, that are called preferred indifference. And all these preferred indifference are things that tend to make life go a bit smoother, okay? So nothing too fancy. And so remember when I said that they're going to reabsorb the intuition that life tends to go better with health rather than sickness, with wealth rather than poverty? This is how they reabsorb that intuition. And so there's already a very convincing and obvious answer to why a Stoic would pursue these preferred indifference. It's simply that you're more likely to be virtuous in preferred rather than dispreferred circumstances. So if I had $1, I could be generous, but then I'd starve. So I'm probably not going to be generous, right? I'm not going to display that virtue. But if I had $1 million, I'm much more likely to be generous, to give it away, And when I do, the impact of my generosity is going to be so much greater, okay? So this reason is going to be sufficient basically for all of us, because the Stoics make a distinction between the practitioner, someone who's still trying to be more virtuous but won't necessarily be in all situations, and the sage. Okay, the sage is someone who's perfectly virtuous in all situations. How many sages have there been in history? 0. Maybe Socrates. So basically, everyone you meet, including Marcus, is just a practitioner. And for practitioners, it's very obvious why you go after these preferred indifferents, okay? They're almost just instrumental to virtue. But that can't be the full answer, because even the sage goes after these preferred indifferents. So the second and deeper answer here is that the Stoics think there are 2 categories of value. One category of value is virtue and vice. That's all you need for happiness. Those are the only determinants of happiness. The other value is preferred and dispreferred indifference. And these are valuable things that give you reasons to act, even if the result of those actions don't impact your happiness. Okay, I know that's very confusing, so let me give you an example. Let's say I'm a doctor. As a doctor, my goal is to save patients. As a good doctor, or so I've been told, I don't allow my happiness to be tied to whether the patient is actually saved or not, because I'm going to go crazy. What I judge, what I evaluate my job on, is how well I attempted. How well did I give it my all to save the patient? So if I gave it my all, patient still dies, I'm not going to feel upset, because I did literally everything I could. Now, in the converse, even if the patient survives, but I was messing around, I took a nap during surgery, I'm going to be pretty upset with myself. So my happiness is completely uncorrelated with whether the patient is actually saved, but completely correlated to how much effort I put into saving the patient, okay? So in this case, the patient's life is an indifferent to me, right? Because whether he's actually saved or not is completely uncorrelated to my happiness, but his life is a preferred indifferent. His life is valuable. It is good that he is saved. And if I want to be happy with myself, right, I have to do my best to save him. So it turns out that Stoic happiness is actually deeply entangled with the external world, but just not in the way that we thought it would be. My happiness is dependent on striving towards the proper indifference, even if I don't obtain them, okay? And so I know what you're thinking now. You're thinking, wait, but I thought the whole point of this whole lecture so far was that externals don't matter for our happiness, right? I thought that was the claim. It kind of is. It's a bit more precise than that. It doesn't matter if you have those externals or not. Wealth, security, justice. Because we showed in any circumstance, as long as you react with virtue, you're going to thrive. But what is virtue? Part of what it consists in is the proper selection of preferred indifferent. Okay? So the virtue of a doctor, the best thing the doctor can possibly do, is to go after the preferred indifference, which is the patient's life. The virtue of the unlucky sage is to escape torture, part of it at least, right? That's a dispreferred indifferent, and to make himself more healthy. That's a preferred indifferent. So your happiness is not dependent on whether you have those external goods, wealth, health, beauty. It's totally dependent on virtue, but virtue is dependent on aiming at those preferred indifferents. So your happiness is also dependent on aiming at those preferred indifferents, striving towards them, even if it's uncorrelated with actually having them, okay? And this is where the big break between the Cynics come in. The Cynics don't recognize another class of value. So the Cynic says, look, health and illness and wealth and poverty, there's no preference between them. And the Stoic critique is, look, if you don't treat the external world as having any preference, then you actually lose the basis for internal virtue as well. Think about something like moderation. If I eat so much that I throw up, never happened. It's funny because it has happened multiple times. The Stoic would say, look, you're not being moderate. Why? Because the action tended towards a dispreferred indifference, towards illness, right? But if the cynic doesn't make any distinction between health and illness, then suddenly moderation, the virtue of moderation, makes no sense. If the cynic doesn't make any distinction between financial security and complete bankruptcy, then prudence makes no sense. So if you give up this idea that there's any difference in value in the external world and external goods, then you actually at once lose the basis to talk about virtue, right? Because part of what virtue is aiming and striving towards the preferred indifference. It's about responding best to whatever situation you're in. So preferred indifference is not an oxymoron, because each of the words points to a different class of value. Preferred simply means that it's good that the world be this way. It's good that my life be this way. Indifferent means that whether the world and my life is actually this way has no impact on my happiness. So all preferred indifferent means is something that I have reasons to strive towards, even if whether I achieve that or not is irrelevant to my happiness. So there's two failure modes for the Stoics, two large failure modes at least, when it comes to their relation with external goods. One failure mode is to ignore the indifference part, right? That's the one that most of us fail at. We don't treat health as an indifferent. We're attached to it. We treat it as something directly related to our happiness. And in the doctor's case, this would be a doctor who ties his happiness to the life of the patient, right? Because he doesn't treat it as an indifferent. That's one failure mode. But there's another failure mode that's a lot less likely, but this is what the cynics get themselves in, which is to ignore the word preferred. And that's to eradicate any value in the external world whatsoever. And so that would be a doctor who says, well, dead or alive, who really cares? Who just bums around and, I don't know, takes a nap during surgery. So to summarize all of this very crudely, what preferred indifference are, if you want to think about it this way, is that there are good states in the world, okay? So it is better for me to be healthy rather than sick. Okay, it's better for society to be secure rather than chaotic, in the same way that it's better for a fish to be in water than in the air, okay? Things just function better this way. And just like the doctor has duties to the patient, I have duties or I have reasons to bring about better states of the world. And just like the doctor's happiness is dependent on him trying to save the patient even if the patient dies, my happiness depends on me giving the best shot at pursuing and selecting some of these indifferents even if I fail. Okay? So if none of this made any sense to you whatsoever, first of all, not my fault, the Stoics' fault for their bad naming. Cicero said as much. Second of all, I wanted to give you one last lens that perhaps you can try to make sense of all of this. Because you might be wondering, if having these preferred indifferents, health, wealth, security, doesn't matter for my happiness, why would striving towards it make me happy, right? Like, surely if being healthy or beautiful doesn't matter, why would trying to be healthy or beautiful, why is that a constitutive aspect of happiness? So one lens that the Stoics don't use, because it's a modern word, but I think could be helpful, is the idea of meaning, okay? I think it's very intuitive for us to think that what meaning requires, what a meaningful life is when we are pulled by reasons outside of ourselves, when we are aiming towards some greater good outside of ourselves. So take the case of Marcus. Marcus spends his life pursuing wealth, health, security, justice for himself, for his family, for the Imperium. And that's a meaningful life because he tried his best to bring about a better state of the world, because he is connected to something larger than him. So what's wrong with the bum? What's wrong with the bum who doesn't do anything is that he doesn't live a meaningful life. If I don't try to make money when I'm bankrupt, if I don't try to stop being tortured, if I don't try to help a person clearly in need, I'm solipsistic. I'm enclosed in my own sphere. I'm not moved by any of the values, any of the reasons in the world that should move me, and therefore my world is meaningless. And so this is, I think, where we can revisit the unlucky sage. Because remember, the unlucky sage is not automatically happy in misfortune. he's automatically not miserable because he treats everything as indifferent, but he's only happy because he reacts to everything with virtue, right? So the unlucky sage does courageously try to build a business and family. The unlucky sage does try to escape the cartel. And it's not perfect, but maybe you can see how his life can be meaningful. He's almost like a failed revolutionary, right? He tried his best to bring about a better state of the world. And maybe that's another way to understand why the unlucky sage is just as happy as the lucky sage. Because both of them gave it their all in every instance of their life to try to engender a better state of the world. So even though their circumstances were radically different, their vector of aiming towards the good is the same. And that's what makes them equally happy. And the key intuition here is that it's the movement towards the good. It's the motion of your life of trying to bring about a better world. That is what generates meaning and happiness. Okay? Again, a rough modern approximation, but I hope that helps. So if it's easier for you to think about meaning, then the Stoic key to happiness becomes something like, what makes a life meaningful, worth living, is that you try your best to bring about a better state of the world, even if you fail. Okay? That's the preferred indifferent. And this doctrine of preferred indifferent is what makes Stoicism both an immanent and transcendent philosophy at the same time. It's what makes it both this worldly and otherworldly at the same time. Stoicism is made otherworldly because your happiness is supposed to rise above any of the wiggles of fortune. But it's fully this worldly because to get that happiness, part of it at least consists in aiming at targets that all of us are aiming for. Health, wealth, the traditional goods. And so the closest thing that I've actually come across to this kind of both immanence and transcendence at the same time are these sects of Tibetan Buddhism that teach the practitioner that they should practice in the world. And so to end this section, I want to relay the warning I got from the masters when I was inquiring into those traditions, which is that this is hard mode, okay? You may think this is easier because you get to keep pursuing wealth and health and get to keep taking care of your loved ones and your family. This is hard mode. The monastery is the easy mode. It's easy to be indifferent to sex and money when you can't have any. It's a lot harder to be indifferent when you're engaged in the world. So perhaps I'll end this section with a reminder of what Augustine said, which is that abstinence is a lot easier than moderation. So don't be fooled. This is hard mode. Okay. So those are the key tenets of Stoic ethics. Number one, externals don't determine happiness. The entire family makes this jump. Number two, virtue is the only determining factor. Virtue only matters for happiness, right? This is the break from Aristotle the Cynics and the Stoics make. And number three, some externals are preferred indifference. This is the break with the Cynics. So now that we have this philosophical structure underneath us, let's try to revisit, right, that quote we began this lecture with and see if we can make more sense of it. When you kiss your child goodnight, you should say silently, tomorrow perhaps you will meet your death. The life of my child is an indifferent. Hopefully we know what that means by now. It doesn't mean I don't care. It doesn't mean I'm apathetic. What it means is that my happiness does not necessarily need to be dependent on whether my child lives or not. What it means is that there are people who have their children passed away, who have let them go with equanimity, and therefore it is possible for me too. But of course, my child is not just an indifferent, it's a preferred indifferent, right? And what that means is that it's natural for us to have children, it's valuable that my child is healthy, and even stronger, I ought to do everything I can to ensure his security, because that's what virtue in this domain demands of me as a parent, right? So I hope you can finally see why the critique of the Stoics as being detached is so off base. because the Stoic parent is no less urgent in helping his kid as the good doctor is urgent in saving the patient, right? And so this meditation of death is not just the stripping method. It's not just trying to get some distance as a preempting some kind of tragedy. Paradoxically, it's also about helping you appreciate your kid's presence more. Okay, I quote, "Dwell not on what you lack, but what you have, and reflect how eagerly you would have sought them if you didn't have them." So by thinking of my child's death, I can take him less for granted, right? I can highlight how precious his value is for me, how fragile that value is, which gives me even more reasons to act on his behalf. That's Stoic ethics in a nutshell. And there's a whole side of their philosophy that we haven't even begun to cover yet. There's a God with a providential plan. There's big bangs and big crunches. There's a fantastic system of logic. But I wanted to focus this lecture today on the ideas that we can most readily take and use in our own lives. And so I think that this first claim of Stoic ethics is not just right, but it's right in a very profound way. Because I did treat my life, my happiness, as a function of externals. But I think the Stoics are right, which is that how well lived my life is has a lot more to do with how I live that life, how I relate to the external circumstances than the external circumstances themselves. But frankly, they lost me after that, okay? So in the second claim, I totally side with Aristotle. The unlucky sage is not as happy as the lucky sage. In fact, I have so many issues with their position that I'm going to do a dedicated lecture just to Cicero's critique of Stoicism in his De Finibus. Now, but with that said, being forced to wrestle with all their arguments about treating things as attached or indifferent, about meaning and where meaning really comes from, has really helped push me to realize just how much of happiness is in my control. Even if they didn't get me to the 100% position that they claim, right? It's by wrestling with the Stoics, I got from like a 20% to a 90%. And so because my disagreements with them at this point are more of degree than of kind, I readily and happily will take all of their therapeutic techniques, right? The stripping method, meditations on death, journaling. But the most important perspective that I got must be this idea that life's setbacks are challenges and not tragedies. Now, you might feel quite daunted by this kind of superhuman ideal that Marcus has put in front of us. And the only comfort I can give you is that it was daunting for Marcus too. Someone who's not tempted by posthumous fame doesn't have to write himself every other night. It doesn't matter. Someone who's not in deep pain by the passing of each of his children doesn't have to form this weird nightly ritual. And someone who isn't at least tempted by revenge has no need to write, I quote, "The best kind of revenge is not to become like them. See that you never feel towards misanthropes as they feel towards the human race." We must not forget that this book right here is his journal, right? It's another Stoic self-therapy. It's another Stoic technique. And as such, it describes not who Marcus was, but who Marcus fought incessantly to become. And in that way, I found it almost even more inspirational because it makes him a lot more relatable, right? Because you can pick up practically any book in the library at this point and you can find someone lecturing to others. You can find someone telling others to be better. But this is a book where a man is caught exhorting himself to be better. And so after finishing this, more so than any other work, it feels like I'm not just exposed to a set of ideas, but I've been introduced to a man, and dare I say a friend. Because something very weird happened midway through prepping this lecture. I realized when I was trying to shorten the name, Marcus Aurelius, I went for the first name and not the last name. And think about how weird that would be for any other thinker we've covered so far. If I called Nietzsche Fred, if I called Rousseau Jean, or if I called Shakespeare Will. But for some reason, Marcus just rolls off the tongue. And I found that quirk deeply comforting because, to be honest, when I first started this book and I finished chapter 1, I felt this sense of dread. So chapter 1 was Marcus detailing all the virtuous people he had in his lives, all the people that were essential for his formative upbringing. It was his wise mother, it was his even wiser adopted father, and his whole entourage of philosophical tutors. And I felt this sense of dread because I realized how important these people were for his upbringing. But who did I have in my life? Who are exemplars of virtue that I look up to, that I can learn from? Certainly not you guys. I don't have a philosopher queen as a mother. I don't have the realm's wise men on speed dial. But after finishing this book, that dread went away because I realized I did have someone in my life. Someone who's more relatable than an imperial parent can be. Someone who's more honest than an imperial tutor dare be. I realized I had my friend Marcus through his meditations. Thank you. Thanks for watching my lecture. If you want to go even deeper into these ideas, then join my email list at jonathanb.com. You'll not only get full-length episodes, but also book notes, essays, and invitations to future lectures. Now, if you're curious to learn more about Stoicism, I have a whole series of interviews and lectures covering Seneca, Epictetus, Cato, as well as the greatest critics of the school. You can find links to all those episodes and everything we covered today in the description, as well as on my website, jonathanb.com. Thank you.